Hello, my name is Neil, and welcome to National Engineers Week. At Boston Children's Museum, we love celebrating E-Week. Typically, we celebrate with local engineers and engineering students. Of course, this year, all of our E-Week content is online, but that's okay. Today, we are joined by an engineer named Maeve, who's going to give us a glimpse into what it's really like to be an engineer. Let's get to it. Hi, Maeve. Nice to see you again. I'm Neil, as you know, and today wanted to talk to you a bit about the work that you do as an engineer. I was hoping we could start by you just introducing yourself and telling us a bit more about, what type of engineer you are and where you work.
Sure. So, hey, Neil, and hey, everybody else watching. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Maeve Carlson, and I'm recording this from Maine in Portland. I am a water and wastewater engineer, and I studied civil engineering at school. I have a master's degree in engineering, but I also went to the University of Maine to get my undergrad and then just continued to get my master's. And right now I'm working at a environmental and civil consulting firm called Wright Pierce, which is in Maine, but they also have different offices across New England and Florida.
Awesome. And can you tell the viewers a bit more about the type of work that someone in your type of engineering field would do?
Yeah. So sometimes when people think of civil engineers, you think of the civil engineers that build the bridges and all the buildings and all the roads. And that's true. But there's also a big group of engineers that provide clean drinking water and then make sure that once that water goes down the drain or is flushed down the toilet, that it's clean again before it gets discharged out into the environment. So I work with a bunch of water and wastewater engineers, and our whole job is to make sure that the environment stays clean so that we can have clean water to drink and use in our everyday life. And then also that when we flush the toilet, that water is then clean before we go and put it back into the environment.
That's crucial, right? Because literally every human being on the planet drinks water and needs that water to be fresh and hygienic. So it seems like that's the type of job which will always have it, a need for engineers and scientists. And that kind of makes me think it's probably not just civil engineers that work on making sure water is clean, right? Are you able to tell us a bit more about like who you work with and what types of jobs they have and how you work together as a team, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. So civil engineering is interesting because sometimes people think engineers just sit in a cube by themselves on their computer typing away and don't have to work with anyone else. But civil engineers actually work with a lot of different people. So we will usually be hired by someone like a town or maybe an individual or a company to do a project. And so these people have a problem that they want us to solve or want us to help fix. And so we're working with our client, is what we call them, and then we also have all of the other people that help us design it. And so we have different types of engineers, we have different types of scientists. We also work with people from the government who help us with the laws that we have to follow to make sure that when we discharge or put something out into the ocean that we're not killing any of the fish and everything that we put out into the ocean is really clean. And so they set the rules that we follow. And then we also have people that actually work at all of these big treatment plants and all of these places that we design in order to operate them every day. And they're the ones who actually are working full time to make sure that you have clean drinking water and clean wastewater.
When I think of clean drinking water, wastewater, uh, I actually don't know this, but where does where does the U.S. fall in terms of like access to clean water compared to other countries? Because I hear about other countries not having as much access to clean water. Is that something you're able to talk about a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So you and I probably don't think very much. When we turn on the tap, clean water comes out for the most part. There are definitely places in the United States that still have problems with access to clean drinking water and access to improved sanitation. There's absolutely communities all over the world that need help with that. But in general, the United States and other countries in Europe and some other areas of Asia and Northern Africa, we do pretty well in terms of our water and our sanitation standards. We don't have to worry about where our water is coming from. But for a lot of people in the world, that's a problem that they deal with every single day. And that's actually one of the things that made me want to be an engineer, because I got to see that firsthand when I was doing some volunteering work abroad. And so I went to Ecuador and to Guatemala, and I saw communities that didn't have any clean water to drink. And people like us, as water and civil engineers, are able to help with them and help improve that situation.
Yeah, would you say that uh, just to give us a more complete story of how you kind of arrived to the job you're in now, uh, would you say that that was an important step along the way of you deciding, like, hey, I think this is the type of work I want to do?
So I decided I wanted to be an engineer when I was probably in high school. But I have a family member, my grandfather, who is the tall guy in that picture right there. I'm the little one, probably the same age as some of you. I think I was in fourth grade. And my grandfather was a civil engineer, and he was for his entire life. And he taught me what it was like to be not only someone who thinks um, critically and likes math and science and wants to solve problems, but also wants to show or showed me how big the world was. So that picture that I just showed was me in Egypt with him when I was really young. And not many people get to go to Egypt when they're that little. And so it really opened my eyes to how big the world was. And I saw a lot of people that lived very different lives than I did. And so it always kind of made me interested in how the rest of the world lives. And so from that, I decided to be an engineer and study that in school. I still didn't really know what it meant to be an engineer, but I went to college to do civil engineering, and I started working with an organization called Engineers Without Borders. And it's kind of like Doctors Without Borders, if you've ever heard of that, which is when a group of students or professional engineers go and travel around the world to try to improve communities' standards for water, sanitation. So things like drinking water systems or making latrines, which is where they get to use the bathroom, to try to have a safer environment for them to live with these basic needs that we all have. And so when I started to do that type of work abroad, I was really inspired and I was really excited to keep learning about civil engineering so that I could try to solve some of these problems that we're all working on.
Yeah, and when you talk about solving problems, right, one thing at the museum that a little tagline that we like to use for Engineers Week is that engineers use stuff to make stuff that does stuff. It's very generic and catch all, but that's sort of the point. I think we would love to know more about what stuff you might be using to make stuff and what that stuff does.
Sure. So use stuff to make stuff to do stuff. I would say that for civil engineers, one of the biggest things that we use is the environment, because we get all of our water that we drink and use for other purposes from the environment. And so we have to first make sure that the environment is clean so that we don't have to do extra work to make the water clean when we want to drink it. So we use the environment to make clean drinking water. And then also, after we're done drinking it, we make clean wastewater so that process is repeated, and that we can do like the do stuff part is to make sure that everyone gets the basic services that they need for water and improve sanitation through a clean environment.
And the water sanitation, the technology that you create, is that like a small thing, or is it something really, really big? Like, is this something that someone can hold in their hand, or is it something like what is it? I guess.
So I guess the answer to that would be both. So one of the things that is really, really special about water treatment and wastewater treatment is that it happens in a lot of different ways. And as civil engineers, we're able to pick the best way that would work for each different community that we're working with or in each situation that we're working with. You can have something as small as a tiny little filter or even just a drop of some chemicals in some dirty water to make it clean enough that you can drink it. But at the same time, if you're living in a big city, you have a giant water treatment plant that is just dedicated to making sure you have clean water. And this is talking about millions of gallons a day that's pumping through this plant so that everyone can have the water to drink. So it has lots of different technologies, and we're learning more and more every day about different ways to make the environment cleaner on both ends, from the source water that we're trying to protect and keep as pristine as possible, to then the wastewater treatment to make sure that everything that we're putting back into the environment is just as clean as when we took it out.
Mhm. I believe you have some images that you can show us, right, to kind of provide some visuals.
I do. Let me share my screen.
Awesome.
All right. So this is one picture of a water treatment plant. And you can see over here, this is where the water's coming in from. And then all of these buildings and lagoons are helping the water get treated before it comes to the community, so that it comes to you and I so that we can drink it. And so this is a really big plant, but at the same time, you can have something really small like this right here. I have a dog and she just whined in the background. So this is another water source, but this is on a really small island off the coast of Maine. And I got to work here for a summer. And so everything that was in that big, big building is actually right here in this little shed. And this is where we treat our water at Hurricane Island. And so, for different scales of communities and how many people you have to serve with this water, there's a lot of different ways that you can treat it. And sometimes it's really big and sometimes it's really small.
Mhm.
So, this is two really big water storage tanks. And you can see a car right there for scale. It's pretty small. So, these are really huge. But at the same time, this is probably serving a big community in Massachusetts. But these tanks are much smaller, and you can see a person for scale right here. And these are tanks that I installed in the jungles of Ecuador to try to serve a really small community that didn't have any water. And so you can see that the technology is very similar, but the scale is really different. And you can probably imagine some of the things that are different between constructing those big tanks in the US, when there are roads and machines that can help you do it, and when you're trying to do something like that in the middle of the jungle. Believe it or not, these tanks were carried up the hill by four people who just had them with, like, had them carrying them on their back.
Wow. Must have been very heavy even for four people. It's just because it looks like it's the size of 15 people. So that's, yeah, pretty impressive. And are they powered somehow up on the mountain there? Is there electricity to make them work?
No, so this design isn't completely finished, but that's another difference between designing a water treatment or wastewater treatment system in the United States, in like a community like maybe you and I live in, and trying to do one in a really remote place. So these tanks don't have any sort of power that's supplying water to them. So usually there's a pump, and the pump takes water from a water source, so a river or maybe underground, and brings it into the tanks, and then it stays there, and then it sometimes pumps it down to the community. In this case, we just have to rely on gravity. So the water source is actually much higher in the mountains, and we have a big pipe that connects to these tanks. And so it just flows freely into the tanks, and then the community is way down here in the valley. And so then the water goes also by gravity from the tanks into the community.
Wow,
Um,
that's so cool.
yeah. So another good example would be a wastewater treatment plant. This is one that's in York, Maine, that I got to work on. And you can see that it's really beautiful right next to the ocean up here. And so that there's a lot of resources available. And so you can have lots of different types of treatment to make sure that it's really efficient before it's discharged into the water here. By the time it gets put into the ocean, it's really clean and safe to discharge. So that's one option. And then here's another option when you maybe don't have as much going on. So this is a design we had for a septic tank and treatment system in Honduras. And so you can see that similar, there's a bunch of tanks and some piping that connects them, but there's not as much space. This is a person per scale. So this is again a lot smaller, and you have to be creative in terms of what resources, what technology you have available to you. This is also a system that's not powered, it doesn't have any electricity. And so you have to really be careful about what you have available to you. A final example would be something like this from Hurricane Island, which is an even smaller system, but you can see this pipe coming out of the shower house right here, which has wastewater that comes in this pipe into this area. And you might think there's nothing there, that's just grass. But it's actually an engineered system, it's a composting wetland. And so in this situation, we're just using nature to filter the water naturally and then to discharge it back into the earth. And by the time it gets discharged, it's all clean. And so you can have something as simple as using natural systems to maybe having something like this, where it's man made, but it's actually pretty simple, to something as complex as a full wastewater treatment plant here in the US.
Very cool. Thanks for sharing all these visuals. This was really helpful, and it kind of made me just kind of underscored what I was already thinking in terms of the way I know, excuse me, the way I know engineers have to solve problems. Clearly, you had to solve multiple different problems for different circumstances in different ways. So I see that now, and that kind of makes me actually want to even rewind, take a further step back, and ask. Of course, it's nice to have these like triumphs and success moments when you solve a problem like this, but I'm sure you probably dealt with a bit of like frustration along the way, or you've had speed bumps. Any chance you're able to tell us a bit about what that may have been like?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the things that I struggle with the most being an engineer is that there's a lot of problems in the world. And once you learn about them, you kind of want to solve every single one. But of course, that's not something that anyone could do. And so I've had to really learn how to find something that I can impact myself and then work towards that with the goal of maybe one day moving on to another problem to solve and then another problem. But for now, you can have impact if you start even as small as just learning about these problems for yourself so that you're educated and know about them. And then maybe after that, you can decide that you want to study something one day that helps you solve them. So that's one of the things I really like about engineering is that even though there's a lot of problems in the world, all engineers get to work to solve them. And so every day you get to feel like you're actually working towards something that has a meaning. Another thing that sometimes is frustrating is that it takes a lot of time to do some of these designs correctly. And so engineering's pretty hard. It's a hard major, it's a hard thing to study. Just look at how big this wastewater textbook is. That's like as big as my head.
That seems heavy.
Right. So you have to learn a lot in order to be good at your job and to be able to help people the way that you want to. But after, if you put in the work, it's very worthwhile. But I would say that, yeah, my biggest frustration is not having enough time to do all the things that I really want to.
Sure. No, that totally makes sense. And, of course, as an engineer, uh, you're going to feel the need to like be working beyond perhaps 8 hours a day. And I'm sure can be very intense. And that kind of makes me wonder actually, what do you do with your time outside work as an engineer? Like tell us a bit about the Maeve who's not an engineer.
Sure. Well, I will admit that a lot of my free time is still spent volunteering doing things that are sort of like being an engineer, but a little bit more fun. And so I do a lot of things with Engineers Without Borders, but that allows me to travel around the world to do these projects, which is not always work. Some of it's very fun. And then also work at Hurricane Island, which was on a beautiful island. And I got to spend the summer out there looking at some of their engineering systems. So a lot of the things that I do for myself feel like work, maybe, but actually they're just fun. In addition to that, I have a dog who is sleeping on the couch next to me, and she takes up a lot of my time. And I also like to go outside and go rock climbing and just be outside, um, hiking around and hanging out with friends. It's been really nice to grow up in Maine, which is so beautiful, and just being able to take advantage of being around all of this great natural beauty, I guess.
Yeah, totally. I'm right there with you. Been hiking a lot, and of course now it's winter, but still find time when you can.
Yeah.
Um, this has been awesome. I mean, before we go, I just wanted to ask if there was any sort of like message you had for some of the young viewers, or just generally anything we didn't get to touch upon yet.
Sure. I would say that if people are interested in being an engineer, but aren't sure if they're like good enough at math or like science enough to do it, I think that there's a lot of room for people who just want to help and want to solve problems. And you can still be a really good engineer even if you're bad at math. You can still be a really good engineer if maybe you weren't very good in school, but you really like to talk to people and you really like to find out what the situation is in different communities or in the environment. Maybe you just want to make the world a better place. I would say that engineering has a lot of room in it for a lot of different people. And so if you're interested, give it a shot. I think that it would be a really fun job for the rest of my life.
That's really nice to hear. That's a nice message. Shall we cheers a glass of fresh, clean water before we go?
Sure. Cheers.
Cheers. Well, this has been a lot of fun and really insightful for us. So thank you so much for being able to chat. Um, I'll reach out in a little while just to see how you're doing, and otherwise, have a good night.
Thanks, Neil.